social, economic, and even political aspirations to, for the most part, overlap with those of the revolution. Can I claim to have done any actual anthropological work, to have spoken to thousands of officers currently in service? No, I can't. But I can give some form of smaller explanation as to why it is that we're not seeing mass rupture within the institution. Several reasons. The institution's always had different sections. It's always had the barracks that pray, and then the other barracks where you're not allowed to have beards at all. It's always had, the barracks where you're allowed to be a Salafi, and that's cool, and it's encouraged by certain officers. And it's had the other barracks where you need to be a Nasserist and only a Nasserist, right? That's always been the kind of military that it is. And in terms of the kind of military that it has been in the context of the revolution, as in the military that you guys have been seeing massacring people in Muhammad Mahmoud or in Tahrir or in Alexandria, that military is a very, very small section of the Egyptian military, and it's a recurring section, i.e. I will be in Tahrir Square on the 7th of July and once again, for example, in November and December, and it will be the same Katiba, Hamdi Badin's units, that will be taking out the operation against the protesters, right? Is it feasible to say that there are 6 to 10 units that have taken out every single act of military aggression in the last 3 years? Absolutely. What is that as a percentage of the masses of conscripted youths that are only in the army for a passing year to 3, and then back to their most often, quite working class areas and jobs and communities? Quite very much the majority that are in barracks that, for example, in Port Said, I know this because I had friends that got the day off the day after, all the radio inside the barracks said was, the surprise tonight, El-Masri, Port Said Al-Masri beats Al-Ahli. No mention of 74 dead, nothing. And when you, there's those that are conscripted and work in the army's soup factories and pasta factories and petrol stations, etc. But there are also many, and over 50% of those that are conscripted will be in barracks, entirely cut off from what's happening, never to have at all come into contact or face to face with the revolutionary that they're being asked to shoot. And that's really the extent of my answer on that question. I can't, unless we want to do some research, I couldn't really speak any further on that. In terms of violence against women in Tahrir, yeah, it's become epidemic. It started very, 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 as a very light kind of state tactic in the 18 days themselves, right at the very end of them. Never really succeeded because there was this actually quite paternalistic, notion of protect the women, so there'd be pools and pools and pools of women circled by men that literally wouldn't allow anyone to pass through or out unless one of the women allowed them in as their brother or their friend or son, etc. So that was kind of happening in the 18 days. I'm sure you've all heard about March, where there was the massive International Women's Day march, and then the virginity test that later took place against female protesters and revolutionaries by the army. And that's really when the narrative of females and women that take to the square, that take to protest, are to be judged on the intactness or not of their hymen, basically that they are sluts, that they are prostitutes, that they are there to solicit sexual favors, etc. That started, and it really took quite a while for that narrative to be accepted within society at large, and then of course as that filters into those sections of society that are taking part in the revolution, right? And it's safe to say it got incrementally worse. By come kind of July, it was happening on the scale of 5 or 6 reports per protest. Come September, where I myself was in a similar in that kind of situation. It was something that has now become something that you'd expect. I'm telling you how it felt for us. It was something that you'd expected to happen. You went that day looking around you, being constantly careful, because suddenly it was a given that someone might try and harass you or rape you or mob assault you. This increased incrementally as the revolution has gone by. It reached a certain kind of tipping point after in the lead up to and after the presidential elections. The reason for that was that suddenly those large swathes of those that to some extent were also associated with the revolution were also using the narrative of all those who were protesting are sluts and infidels, etc. That it just suddenly got to the point where people that were protesting with you side by side were not only just kind of raping you because they were rapists, no, they were raping you because there was something wrong with you being there as a woman, and that they had some right, some divine right given to them by some MB fucker to do that. And that, of course, happened. But that's not to say that epidemic hadn't broken immediately a couple months into the start of the revolution. In terms of the resistance, it started around January 2012. Several groups of both women and men, although a lot of the time they are unfortunately dominated by men, one of which I'm part of. It's called Operation Opantish, Operation Anti-Sexual Assault. And the way we operate, we move in literally squads of 25, 4 at the front that are on Taser Club, 6 people, and then people inside as well, and you kind of surround the mob, and then people go in, get the victim, or allow her space to then choose to leave or not. We don't carry our victims out of anywhere, and we absolutely all at least Opantish's squads are at least 40% women, 60% men, to ensure that the woman, you know, by the time 60, 70 men have gone through you can't really deal with any men anymore. It's very difficult to believe that you're being assisted, and so yeah, our groups we try as much as possible, but I'm going to be honest, it's difficult because of the mass intimidation of the situation, to be as gender balanced as we can possibly be. Just to give you a basic kind of notion of where it's gone up to, on the 30th of June in Tahrir there were very few reports. In Tahrir there were 99, 6 dead, 6 women dead. These are in the anti-NB protests. I would also point to the fact that this was, as far as reports that I've heard and my very, very limited experience with NB protests, I must say, not as common at all in the NB's protests on that front. Now, movement against Morsi, was the left deceived? Was it a coup? And new attacks on the revolution. Was the left deceived? I mean, okay, a couple things we need to be really, really clear about. Who are the left in Egypt? Very, very, very small bunch of people. Let's say thousands to tens of thousands that might be organised leftists in some sense or the other on that scale of reformist left to revolutionary hard left, and hundreds of thousands that would kind of associate on the basis of leftism with those lefties. Most people would associate on basic notions of, you know, decent living, housing, water, and then kind of that it wouldn't be kind of necessarily a leftist, but possibly a Nasserist element there. So was the left deceived? I mean, no, but it's still quite an irrelevant question for the most part in terms of what happened on the 30th of June. What was happening is someone was talking about the social economic conditions. I don't like to talk too much about that, but of course, I mean, the year that the NB was in power was the highest year for protest, sit-in and strike in Egypt's history. That social base does not go poof. The 4 months in the lead up to the 30th of June, where thousands of strikes were occurring, that can't go poof. In fact, it hasn't gone poof. In the midst of all of the fascist, neo-fascist, weird coup, not a coup stuff that's going on, there's still strike action that's trailing straight ahead, because those back-paid wages and those very serious issues, particularly to do with pensions and actually more social political things like women's rights and harassment, are training ahead regardless. And they have nowhere to go but forward, right? There isn't quite any stopper that the left or anyone could put on hungry mouths and unsatisfied immediate aspirations, like being able to walk in the street as a woman. So that's happening. What happened on the 30th of June, I mean, it seems that it's quite difficult for people here to get, but, you know, there's always a flux, there's always a battle of narratives, of whose narrative will win. And in the lead up to the 30th of June, the protests against the NB, the mass movement against the NB, was decidedly social, it was decidedly democratic, it was majority poor, teachers, doctors, working classes, and the youth and the unemployed. But then no one ever said that we had won over the entirety of Egypt's population to an anti-military position. Tahrir Square was shaking month after month with those chants, and yet millions sat at home and berated them for that only a few months before. And so it's not at all surprising that the revolution got ahead of itself, and quite frankly, in the 3 to 4 weeks leading up to the 30th of June, the nationalist TV songs started on TV. The only two films that were showing were one about the 67 war and one about the 73 war. The old speeches of Nasser talking about the MB and their role in the whole spat with supporting the British-aligned monarchy was all over TV again. All of these old narratives of there being some trans-political, trans-generational gene that lies inside of every single MB member that finds them to be traitors to Egypt and having allegiances to some higher Islamic caliphate came up suddenly. And in the space of literally 2 weeks' time, people that you would previously entrusted with your life on the front line would turn around and say something along the lines of, when you try to protest against the army on the 30th, they turn around and say, this isn't the time, Mishwatu, let's get rid of these guys first, and then we'll deal with the army. That's what was being said on the morning of the 30th of June. By 6 p.m. on the 30th of June, it became impossible to chant against the military because you were getting the shit beaten out of you. I myself was one of them. And by the following day, it was completely out of the question to chant against the military, because suddenly chanting against the military came to be immediately construed as supporting the Muslim Brotherhood's government and their reign, their rule, their actions or whatever, and you suddenly got called basically supporting, you'd be either called a fascist for supporting the army, or from comrades over here, you'd be called a fascist for supporting the military. It was great. My mother kicked me out of the house because I was a fascist, because I was supporting the MB, supporting them as in they shouldn't die, mum. And in that very exact same instant, you'd be getting comrades here in the West literally calling you a fascist because apparently you were supporting the military, because I wasn't in Rab'a Adawiyya chanting with blood, with soul, I die for you, Islam. And I am proud of that. Now that does not mean that I will not be there whenever and however I possibly can to say freedom of the right to protest, freedom of speech, freedom for the Muslim Brotherhood to have their organizations, because if you send them over underground, literally everything we have done in the last 2 years to undermine them will be lost immediately. And already this is the best thing that has happened to the MB in 2 years. Membership's gone up again. They're back to being the conventional old good guys that are being hounded by the baddie old government. It's looking dandy. It's looking pink. The money's coming in. It's great. It's great. And so, this is the dilemma we find ourselves in. And quite frankly, comrades, it's been quite difficult. The kind of stuff that's been coming out of the West, it's been really difficult. It hasn't shown solidarity for those of us on the ground who are trying our mightiest to shift things, to push things in a better direction. But what did you want on the 30th of June after a year of protests, sit-ins, strikes, and mass revolutionary movement like we had never personally seen before? What did you want us to do when suddenly the army managed to take it over? How could we turn around to 1 million, 2, 3, possibly 4 in Cairo alone and go, sorry, I want you to put the halt on that for a bit. We need to kind of go, how does that practically work? That's what I'd like to know. And if you don't have a straight answer for it, then we need some dialogue, we need some conversation about what happened, what is happening, and how we can move forward with this without, quite frankly, the way The Guardian is now quoted by the MB and Hizb an-Nur is, quite frankly, amazing. It's brilliant. It's literally just tipped Ahram Online on its head. They don't know who to quote anymore. And on Haytham Mohammedin's arrest is precisely what's going to happen when this kind of thing has happened. The army is pushing forward as fast as it possibly can with counter-revolutionary act after the other to see how much it can squeeze in before people come out of their, the war on terror reverie. And Haytham Mohammedin isn't at all an isolated incident. Student protests in particular in the last 2 weeks, and this hasn't been reported at all in the West, have been particularly violently treated and arrested all up and down the country, in Mansoura, Alexandria, and as well as Cairo. 25 activists or so, their names were announced as they were going to be arrested, and then within 2 hours there was a massive kind of backlash in the media, and so immediately it was withdrawn. And so, I mean, SCAF's playing balloon games, right, where it's testing to see how far it can go, and then if it doesn't work, it will immediately just play it as a false kind of alarm, and if it does work, it pushes through straight ahead. And so every single attack that can possibly be brought against the revolution, SCAF will be trying to bring now, but of course is already brought in the basic kind of banning of the MB's protests based on the fact that the majority didn't like what they had to say. I mean, that was the first attack on one of the revolution's pretty much only victories, the right to protest. So yeah, that is precisely where the army is going, and of course the money's on how far and how fast those millions out there that either remember getting shot by the army and the Ministry of Interior come out of this, and B, of course, this is what a lot of people don't seem to be very attuned to, is that the MB had very, very serious links with the utmost of Egypt's working poor and rural poor. Right, so there's a lot of people that had no expectations of Mubarak, didn't give a fuck, quite frankly, if he left or came, because he never did anything for them. But there's the MB that did, or at least used to, right? And then that stopped. That stopped. The free healthcare stopped. The cheap foodstuffs and food supplies stopped. Suddenly, the MB was sitting down with Izz on the one end and Netanyahu on the other, and and that certainly disillusioned millions of people that were as yet never to have been involved in any revolutionary discourse. And there's one key point about that, is that these people didn't necessarily associate the army's presence with counter-revolution, just like those millions of people, the nice ones, the goodies of 25th of January, also didn't associate the army with counter-revolution and were chanting one people, one military, one hand, right up until Mubarak's ouster, and really only started coming out with down with military rule in March of 2011, when it became clear that the transitionary period had become too long. Further, that milieu was very much present on the 30th of June. It was massive, in fact. There are, people ask what happened, why aren't people sympathetic to the MB, why are they so willing to support the army? Lots of them had no previous revolutionary memory discourse of the army as clearly counter-revolutionary, and had quite a lot of aspirations in an organization and political current, but that by all means failed them in that year. And that's the source of, on the one end, there being so little sympathy for the MB, and on the other, there being seemingly a lot of support for the army, whereas what you've really got is a couple 100,000 people that went to Tahrir and gave him a tafweed, and shitloads of people that are sitting at home either kind of passively cheering on killing MB members like that's all right, and it's not, or crying in bed like myself. And I'm just going to be really honest here. There's literally nothing I could do. I could go drop off medical aid, which I did. Anything beyond that, I'd be shot by the very same people that you want me to go and protest with, because I'm a slut and an infidel and a piece of shit. So, I mean, this is the corner that we find ourselves in. It's a state of flux. This is really important to get across. This is moving constantly. 3 weeks from now, it won't look the same. It might look decidedly worse. It might not at all. But social and political complexities, that's what we need to start from, and it needn't start from some preordained bad guy, good guy, and we need to impose that, particularly not from high chairs in London, I think. And how strong are those? How strong are those that support neither? They are many. They are many. They are millions that ardently support neither. From your pretty much every taxi driver in the country to everyone that is basically basically knows that the military's curfew this time is no different to the military's curfew last time. It was just some stupid sabuba that they wanted to use for some political grab that ultimately only really fucks millions of people that can only really work at night to make their daily living. There are many millions who have been shot, arrested, aggressed against, or at least know someone who's been aggressed against by the military. That hasn't gone anywhere. That memory still remains there. There is absolutely a veil that's there of, but what are we going to do? It's out of our hands. The MB, I mean, what can we possibly do? They're still going around calling for Morsi to come back, and as soon as they say that, we immediately can't have nothing to say, because the bourgeois reactionary elements that also are against the MB immediately pants on that, like being anti-democratic, like being against the will of the majority, and so you suddenly literally can't even speak, because if you want to speak, you're either against the will of the majority removing the MB, or you're against the, you know, you're against the revolution essentially in letting them die in their thousands. And of course that sentiment is the one sentiment that is correct, is that there shouldn't be any support for the massacres of MB protests insofar and to come. But it won't be for long, is what I think is really, from my opinion, is important to impress. How many minutes do I have left?
It's probably a good idea if we moved into
discussion
now.
خلاص ماشي. I'm gonna move it over to discussion.